welcome to Furious Driving. And now you might remember a couple of weeks ago we did a little video talking about the ubiquitous marina door handle and the number of vehicles that particular item has found its way into. And it turned out that there were far more than we ever expected, and in fact too many to squeeze into a single video, because the list just went on, and some of the cars got more and more quirky and unique and too niche to include. However, that did open a can of worms into the world, the murky world if you like, of car manufacturer parts bin sharing. But looking into that subject, it does turn out that parts bin sharing is a fairly open secret in the car world, but not one the manufacturers really like to talk about, because they like people to think their own design is their own design. However, it goes on all the time. It's far more common than you might imagine. And in this video we're going to look at some of these cars with items that have come from unlikely sources. Some of them you might recognise already, but hopefully some of them will be new to you, and maybe a few surprises along the way. Now there are a lot to get through, but before we get started I just want to say a quick thank you to channel sponsor Lancaster Insurance, classic car insurance specialists since 1984, for making this video possible. Now obviously I'm not going to mention the marina door handles again because we've covered them in enough detail already, but there's lots more to get through. Now we all know that platform sharing at the most basic level goes on all the time, and we all turn a blind eye to it. For example, Volkswagen Group will sell you the same car 4 times over. The Golf is the A3, is the Skoda, which one is it? Octavia, and it's the Seat Leon, just with a different face and panel work and better or worse plastics and fabrics inside to make you feel like you've earned spending a bit more money or less money. And they'll do the same thing with the Polo and its smaller siblings. Likewise, back when Ford owned Volvo and Mazda, you'd find all kinds of unlikely components from the Ford parts bin winding up in quite expensive cars, or parts from Mazdas turning up in other cars, and vice versa. So their platforms and engines and gubbins were turning up in all kinds of unexpected Ford, Mazda, Volvo places. And this even goes on at the very top of the market. The Lamborghini Urus and the Bentley Bentayga are essentially the same car underneath, just one looks pointy and sharp and sporty, and the other one looks sort of bold and bluff and luxurious. But it's the same platform and the same engine. So this happens at every level, from the Polo to the Bentley. But that's not what we're talking about in this video. We're talking about run-of-the-mill car parts from ordinary everyday cars finding their way into high-end luxury exotic sports and supercars, which the manufacturers of those really don't want you to notice. So they try and pass them off as their own. So let's begin at the end, so to speak, because taillights seem to be one of the most commonly shared components because, well, partly I guess they're slightly overlooked because people focus on the front of the car, and designers can do a lot of little tricks to disguise where something came from. They can turn it upside down, they can angle it differently, they can change the fairings and completely change the look of a car's rear tail light and make you not realise where it's come from. And there are a lot of these to get through. So for example, the Ford GT40, the halo car of the 1960s, that used its rear lights from the humble Simca 1000 of all things, so not even from the same continent, although the GT40 was actually engineered quite a lot in Britain, so you can see where the designers might have found inspiration. But sticking with the GT40 theme, there do seem to be an awful lot of fairly low volume but very expensive sports cars that do this similar kind of thing. For example, the Caterham 21 used the taillights from a Mark I Mondeo. Great looking lights, very curvy, very bubbly, and they fitted quite well in the back of that sports car chassis frame, if you like. A little bit less curvy than that, the MVS Venturi, which is a sports car is not so well known, that used the taillights from a BMW E21. The longer, thinner shape of those lights managed to blend in to the back of that car. Now, one of the most prestigious brands you can imagine is Bristol. They are very expensive, hand-built, low-volume cars. You have to basically join a waiting, or had to join a waiting list to buy one. The Bristol Blenheim, back in the 80s, 90s, that used lights from a fairly, well, expensive but very ordinary car. If you look at the back of it, it's quite a big, blocky looking sports car, but gently rounded because of the decade. It borrowed its lights from the back of a Vauxhall Senator. And then there was the Morgan Aeromax, a car which is really quite interestingly designed. It looks like something that's escaped from a cartoon. It needed something very, very extravagant, something exotic for the back, and your average Mark I Mondeo lights weren't going to cut that one. So they went to Italy. They went to a car which already had some of the most exotic lights you're ever going to see. They went to Lancia, where the Thesis tail lights are, well, they look like something out of a hot rod. I've actually seen these same lights in actual high-end hot rod custom cars going to Pebble Beach and things. So the Lancia Thesis, little thin curved strips that vertically curve over the back of the wing. were the perfect fit for that. Sometimes you wonder if they designed the car first and then found lights to fit, or found the lights first and then designed the car to fit. One particular case of that was actually the Mark I Land Rover Discovery, where they used taillights from the Maestro van, the kind of thin vertical lamps, which have about a 45-degree flat side to them. And they did actually angle the corners of the Land Rover Discovery into that complete flat side to make the car match the lights, to save engineering new lights and the production costs of that. I mean, that was a bit of a bitzer car in the first place. It's a wonderful car, save Land Rover, but underneath it is basically a Series 1 classic Range Rover. There was a V8 option, but mostly it was a 200 TDI you found powering those things. But it's got the same ladder chassis, the same floor pan, the same bulkhead, the same doors even on that thing. So some very clever design work going on to disguise the look of the Discovery, make it look a little bit different. We mentioned the Mark I Mondeo taillights once already. We can mention them again now, because another high-end sports car, which cost an awful lot of money, was the Noble M12. And everyone knows that Noble's borrowed the Ford Duratec V6 out of the Mondeo. Of course, twin-turboing it and mounting it in the back and sticking a very light car indeed. It absolutely transformed what the engine can do compared to your Repmobile. Everyone knows that. What many people don't notice is that if you walk around the back of the thing, you'll find another pair of Mondeo taillights hiding in the back of that car. Incredible, really, isn't it? But possibly the most amazing use or reuse of lights is one of the most exotic cars ever built, the McLaren F1. This is the ultimate supercar, perhaps the first hypercar. It's an incredible thing. The 3-seat configuration, the performance, just the exotic exclusivity of that car. I would lay money on you not knowing where the backlights for that car came from, unless you've read one of these lists before, because that came from somewhere very unexpected and as unrelated as you can imagine. The Mondeo is a Ferrari in comparison with its donor, because it took its lights, which, bear in mind, this is the mid-1990s, it got them from the 1982 Bova Futura bus. You'd be forgiven for not noticing that before. Incredible. The Dutch bus gave its taillights to the British hypercar. Who knew? But we've got one more to focus on as far as taillights go, because this is one of my all-time favourites in terms of the car itself and also in terms of parts reuse. Because as you know, I love the Rover R8. I've got a couple of them myself. They're a really nicely designed car and they feel quite high-end and well made for a car of the 1980s into the early 1990s. However, there was one halo car of the 1990s which was going to sort of take British cars to a whole new level, but it turned out to be a bit of a disappointment, or a damp squid, when it finally landed. That was the Jaguar XJ220, which was premiered as a concept car with a V12 engine in the back and 4-wheel drive and 200 miles an hour and many things. When it landed, of course, it had the Metro rally car V6 engine in it, which actually was more powerful than the V12 and only rear-wheel drive. It was actually faster than the concept was promised, but people didn't want to look away from those headline figures. Anyway, the back of that car, underneath that incredibly exotic kind of slatted window to look through the taillights at, you will find the backlights from a Rover R8, which is quite incredible. And if you walk down the side of the car and open the doors, have a quick glance down at the wing mirrors, because they came from the humble VW Corrado, no less. Who knew? You think Jaguar is quite a mainstream company and they're big enough to be making their own components, but even, well, I guess a small fish in a big pond, if you like, even they have to sometimes cut costs on development and dip into the parts bins of other manufacturers and just subtly reuse things and hope no one notices. But perhaps the king of the parts bin when it comes to borrowing as many things as possible is the Aston DB7. Now, if you think Jaguar is a minnow in a big pond, Aston Martin really are the minnowest of minnows. The company which punches so far above its weight in terms of the number of cars it sells and the financial straits it constantly finds itself in. Aston Martin are quite incredible that they're still going and creating such beautiful, incredible cars. The DB7 was a bit of a rehash in its own right. It was taking Ian Callum's Jaguar XK, reworking it into something a bit more exciting and more powerful and more exotic. Well, barely any more exotic, because it was exactly the same car pretty much. But in order to make it their own and make Aston Martin have their own unique look, they raided a number of parts bins around the world to give the DB7 its differences from the Jaguar. So at the back of it, you'll notice it's got these lovely thin curving lights which wrap around the tail of the car and absolutely fit Ian Callum's design perfectly. Quite a surprise when you think they came from a Mazda 323F, which is a 5-door hatchback. Very, very different, although perhaps not massively surprising when you consider that Aston Martin were also part of the Ford Premium Automotive Group, as were Mazda, and so they probably had access to those bits relatively inexpensively, as they did with the MX-5, because when you try and get into the large door of the DB7, you'll notice a little tiny door handle. That came from the Mazda MX-5. And the exterior door handles were found on a Mazda 626 estate. Amazing. But what didn't come from the MX-5 were the Granada mirror switches. That little kind of round thing that you turn and twiddle your mirrors around came from a Granada, as did the key. That unusual tumbler switch door key, which everyone kind of lambasted back in the 90s, came from Ford. And if you look around the dashboard, you will find most of the switch gear, in fact, came from the Ford parts bin on the Aston DB7. The only thing that didn't come from the Ford Premium Automotive Group parts bin was, of course, the Citroën CX door mirrors. Again, and these are some of the most famously well-used door mirrors across the manufacturing industry, because they are an amazingly good-looking door mirror and they just fit seamlessly into quite exotic cars. Other cars that borrowed these same mirrors, which are going to feature further down the list for others they've pilfered, are the Lotus Esprit Mark II, which has got the Citroën mirrors, and incredibly, the TVR Griffith 400 apparently. But jumping back to Aston Martin, of course, the king of the parts bin raiders, we can go all the way back to the DBS, that great big, enormous thing, the imposing grille, the big engine, the huge bonnet. Walk around the back of that car, it's another one with taillight specials. Hillman Hunter taillights, those little square taillights nicked from Hillman Hunter. Who knew? And those were popular lights though, because back in the day, the Bristol 411 S4 and the Bond Bug, which is some illustrious company and some very different cars, all making use of that same component around the back. A more recent one, the Alfa Romeo 4C. I mean, that is a pretty car, and again, you can't imagine anything from another vehicle fitting so perfectly with that lovely sculpture of a body. But if you happen to see one in a Fiat Alfa dealership, see if they've got a Fiat 500 nearby, because you'll notice that the mirrors are the same on that one as well. It's amazing how you don't notice these things until you see them side by side, and then you just can't unsee it. But looking through this list, it does mostly seem to be headlights, tail lights and mirrors are the main things that people share. I mean, parts bin sharing for switches is just absolutely rife. Anything from the Ford Premium Automotive Group will have the same components, and you'll notice the same sat-navs appearing in lots of different cars that are owned by the same company, of course. One that is a little bit of a surprise, have you seen the MG SV, the supercar that was going to save Rover? I'm not quite sure what they were thinking with that one, but it was basically a Mangusta Italian supercar concept which was kind of failing, which MG Rover bought at the 11th hour to create a halo car. They needed to kind of rework it, and Peter Stevens kind of redesigned it, and they needed some headlights that were off the shelf to save costs. And what's a cheap headlight but also is very slim and fits that shape? Mark II Fiat Punto. Next time you're at a car show and you see an MG SV, have a quick squint at the front and you might spot that little slice of Italian slim lightware in the front. The Panther platform, 1979 to 2011. Obviously it's the Ford Crown Victoria police cars and taxi. Also it's the Mercury Marquis, which is the old person's going to the golf club car. It's the Mercury Marauder, which is the trying to be young but still an old person's performance car. And of course it's a Lincoln Town Car, which is a luxury limousine, all on the same platform, the same chassis, the same engine, the same bodywork apart from the taillights and the grills pretty much, just different interiors. And they got away with it for the best part of 30 years. Amazing. But lift the bonnets on some cars and you'll find something that's very familiar with cars that are apparently totally unrelated. And obviously engine sharing is again pretty common because engines are expensive. The MX-5/Unos Roadster was when they put the MX-5 together. It was kind of slightly begrudgingly, and Mazda higher-ups took a lot of persuading to build that particular car. And so they had to go cap in hand to all the parts bin on other departments. So it's got the engine from a regular family car, it's got the gearbox from a van. It's all bits and pieces that have been borrowed from all around the Mazda empire. So look under the bonnet of a Nissan 350Z, almost everyday supercar. Front engine, rear wheel drive with a V6 in it as well. But the 350Z shares its V6 with something as unrelated as you might possibly imagine. The Renault Espace V6, believe it or not. And the Nissan Elgrand, the Renault Espace V6. That's about as un-Nissan 350Z as you can possibly imagine, as is the Nissan Elgrand. And of course the older Renault V6, the PRV, the Peugeot Renault Volvo, that found its way from things like the big Peugeot and Renault executive cars and the boxy Volvo saloons It also found its way into the back of a DeLorean. Incredible. You can't imagine the same thing powering a Volvo 240, well not 240 obviously, but a Volvo 200 V6 in the back of a sports car. Incredible really, the way these things move around. But a lot of these things do tend to be the lower volume, the smaller manufacturers who don't quite have the budget to put things together. So if you look at the Lotus Esprit Mark 1, I mean, again, a super pretty supercar that's a real halo car, a dream car for many. But walk around that car, it's just a bit of a bitzer really. The taillights come from another sports car at least. They came from a Fiat X19. The gearbox came from a Citroen, at least the wing mirrors didn't. And the steering rack came from Triumph. So there's bits of everything all over it. The Esprit Mark II and the Excel, they were a bit more of the old parts bin sharing again. Rover SD taillights, which bigger, chunkier lights for a later era. They kind of fit the evolving styling of them. As I say, the Citroen CX mirrors, of course. And then moving into the Esprit Mark IV, we find bits from the Toyota AE86. Lights, mirrors. Now TVR, another prime contender, and it's not really a surprise to find anything borrowed in a TVR, because let's face it, you can almost imagine them just walking around car parks, seeing if anything is loose on any parked cars, they can just whack on the next car at the factory. They were a little bit tight for money. But the Griffith Mark III Cavalier taillights, the Griffith 400 Mark I Cortina taillights, the TVR Cerberus Mark III Fiesta taillights. They literally were walking around a car park just squinting at stuff going, I reckon that might do. Now we've kind of come to the end of our list there, and this could have gone on for so long. I sat and researched this list for ages and the list just kept on growing and growing. But I don't want to do too many taillights because it gets a bit boring after a while. But one of my favourites is the Pagani Zonda, and this is the ultimate hypercar, at least it was for a little while. Now, you know it's got a Mercedes S-Class engine in there, so they've tuned that thing and turned it from a very fast luxury car, virtually a Maybach, into something incredibly powerful, incredibly fast. But did you know when you're sitting in your incredibly bespoke, unique, handcrafted interior and you're looking at that quite interesting digital heating and ventilation console in the centre of the dashboard, that came from a Rover 400. An entire Rover 400 cost less than the seat from a Pagani Zonda, and yet they've used the heating and ventilation controls because that little kind of curvy digital dashboard and curvy little buttons just fitted perfectly in it. Incredible what works. Now sticking with the Zonda, those have got a fairly simple tail light, and it's an off-the-shelf thing from Hella called the Hella 4169, and it's just a simple round circle red with a little kind of semicircular cutout for the indicator or white for the reversing light. They're a fairly common light, but you'll find them all over the world of exotic cars because the Zonda's got it. The Lamborghini Diablo uses them, as does a new class Combine Harvester. So all the top end good stuff, obviously. I think we've probably covered enough, but I've got one more for you, one more you're going to enjoy, and this is again one of the most exotic cars out there, the Lamborghini Murcielago, the Mercy as they call it on YouTube all the time. This is an expensive car, and for a couple of years it was the YouTuber's favourite. Let's go and rescue an abandoned or abused or pimped up and ruined Lamborghini Murcielago. One thing that a few YouTubers found though was that bits are very expensive for it, apart from one part. Because if you need the side repeater on the front wing of a Mercy, head down to your local Ford dealer and pick up one for a Mark I Focus, because they'll cost you about 15 quid instead of 300. Incredible, but it fits, and unless you knew, you would never know to look for the little Ford logo, but it's there. Amazing, huh? Anyway, this has been a little bit of an insight into some of the world of parts sharing, because there's so much going on. Next time you're sitting in a car, have a look at the buttons and see if you can guess where they came from. Have a look at the mirrors and the lights. See if you recognise them from anywhere else, because there's a good chance you actually might. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, please, as always, hit like and of course subscribe, and join us again next time, driving or talking or fixing about something completely different, but probably a Ford Focus.